The story of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States is quite an intriguing one, with many oddities and anomalies, including this dark angel that watches over the very bluffs at the terminus point of the Transcontinental Railroad. Join me as we explore Dark Angel, Secrets of the Transcontinental Railroad. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad has been something I've always found of worthy historical and academic study. After all, the Transcontinental Railroad was the first true national highway for the United States. And as we look at this imagery of the Missouri River Valley, right at the conjunction point of the great cities of Omaha and Council Bluffs, Iowa, we have to examine this account a little more closely. We recently explored Omaha, the largest city in Nebraska in terms of population and even area, and we found remains of old world structures. Omaha has recently been renovating and building newer structures as we examined, and we looked at the remains of the old ConAgra compound. But what's intriguing about Council Bluffs, Iowa, on the east side of the Missouri River Valley? We have these relentless bluffs, part of the greater Los Hills complex, deposits of silt, or so the geologists tell us. And what is so significant about these bluffs? Well, many people view Iowa as simply flat land, although these bluffs run all along the length of western Iowa, nearly from north to south. There's a lot of other interesting and intriguing details that seem to conform to old world explorations. Are these really just bluffs, or are they something much more elaborate? And why do they run the length of the Missouri River Valley? Very interesting. And of course, are they really just to be construed as deposits of silt? Simple sediment brought about by water or wind, in this case being wind? Or are they the remains of something else? There's also a strange coincidence when we look at the Dust Bowl, where the actual limit of the Dust Bowl occurred, and they seem to have stopped with the Dust Bowl occurrences at the western edge of Iowa, or right along the Los Hills. Perhaps the terrain had something to do with breaking up the Dust Bowl, or maybe it's all just a coincidence. I just found it very intriguing that the eastern extent of where the Dust Bowl occurred happened to line up with where these Los Hills actually exist. Now, going back to the story of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1800s, this is the proposal, a charter to build a railroad from Lake Michigan to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, we know that the Transcontinental Railroad doesn't officially run from Lake Michigan to the Pacific Ocean, but it's along the same lines. Written by Dr. Hartwell Carver, Washington, 1847. Yes, during this particular time when the United States was looking to continue its so-called manifest destiny to reach the Pacific, although official historical accounts inform us that San Francisco was already populated. But really think about this from an old world perspective. How difficult would it be to construct a transcontinental railroad from 1847 onward? And here we see at the point where the two separate construction crews met up. At least that's what the official history tells us. And even looking at the sudden expansion of railroads across the United States is very interesting. We also have this odd conflict of accounts where we understand that the railroad was essential in the United States settling these open western states, going from the plains to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. And here we have the architect, the central figure in the construction and surveying of the Transcontinental Railroad, Grenville Dodge. Originally a land surveyor, an explorer, a settler, an individual who'd become a banker, a civil engineer, and a general during the United States Civil War. In fact, he even operated a very successful intelligence service during the Civil War, working for General Grant. I'm not sure if this is simple degradation of the photo or he had some sort of interesting hair care product. And naturally we see the usual pose of the hand in the coat. Is that really a hidden hand, or do we know exactly where his hand is? Make of it what you will. Dodge has quite an interesting story, and he learned his trade of land surveying from a very peculiarly named individual, one Frederick Lander. No, I'm not making this up, that was the individual's real name. And he died early in the Civil War, during the service of the Civil War, after he tried to resign and his resignation was not accepted, in West Virginia of all places. And so the young Dodge fell under the tutelage of Frederick Lander and learned his trade, eventually culminating in his desire to build a transcontinental railroad, a desire that always seemed to be there. and it included recruiting the help of a particular railway lawyer, at least that's what the official history says, named Abraham Lincoln. Yes, Abraham Lincoln had originally been a railroad lawyer, although the official history says he was a prairie lawyer, whatever that means. And Abraham Lincoln visited Council Bluffs, Iowa, and ascertained in 1859 it was going to be the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. We've examined the account of Abraham Lincoln, the greatest president, or one of the greatest presidents in American history. And what's really to be stated about him? Well, he was a lawyer for the Illinois Central Railroad and the Chicago Central Railroad. Intriguing that these lines run all the way down to the south along the Mississippi, and then they go back up to Illinois, and we can see where the railways then move their way into the relatively new state of Iowa. Yes, once again, more anomalies with Iowa. And I'm not making this up any more than I'm making up the Frederick Lander name. It's intriguing, though, when you look at the earlier pictures of Abraham Lincoln. I recall learning in history that he was considered such an ugly man to look at, that's a historical perspective, not mine, that he needed to grow a beard. But here he's kind of looking like a mix between Daniel Day-Lewis and Alan Alda. So maybe it was just all the stresses that he had to deal with being a lawyer, a railroad lawyer, and then, of course, his marriage, which, as we understand it again from the official historical account, was rather, well, tumultuous with Mary Todd. But more on that to follow. Here he looks a little bit more gaunt, and apparently this is what prompted the growing of the beard. Of course, as we recall from the Civil War time frame, virtually every male in the United States had a beard. You were no one unless you had a beard. Very, very different from the current look of the modern American military male, which seems to sport the completely shaven head and the very intense eyes look. But back in the mid-1800s, it was all about the beard. Little known fact that Abraham Lincoln was actually engaged to another individual, but he didn't go forward with that marriage. A lot of people don't know that, and there's certainly nothing about Lincoln's desire not to go forward with this marriage that defies the so-called historical or societal historical mores of the time. But he did end up wed to Mary Todd Lincoln. What an interesting image we have here of Mary Todd with Lincoln's sons. And there's even more interesting overlaps with the account of how President Lincoln and John F. Kennedy would overlap and connect. There's even that whole story of the curse carried by Robert Todd Lincoln. What an interesting little detail in these early pictures. They're always quite intriguing to examine. And what is this curse I talk about with Robert Lincoln? Well, apparently Lincoln's one surviving son, Robert Lincoln, believed he carried a curse. Every time he was meeting with a sitting U.S. president, that U.S. president would meet with a very untimely demise, and therefore he opted not to meet with any presidents. Now, is that historical fact or merely a myth? I'm not really sure. We, of course, have these political cartoons that talked about how far Lincoln went with his presidential administration during the United States Civil War. And the reason that the official history indicates that President Lincoln was one of the greatest presidents in American history was because he was willing to take the reins of power and do what needed to be done to bring about the real manifest destiny of the United States, both literally and figuratively. We've looked at this very interesting image of Lincoln from the Civil War before with his generals, and it's rather intriguing to me that we have so many different, well, unique appearances for Abraham Lincoln. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's anything strange afoot. It's just that President Lincoln played such an essential role in really deciding the fate of the United States as a nation and in terms of its expansion. And here we have a photograph of Lincoln's initial inauguration in 1861. And I always found this photo so unique because it shows construction of the U.S. Capitol, which, by the way, continued during the United States Civil War. Why let a civil war stop your construction of the Capitol? And why let it stop the construction of a transcontinental railroad? And yet we only have a drawn image of Lincoln's second inauguration address in 1865. So very interesting. We don't have any photographs of this. Well, I'm sure all the photographers were busy covering the Civil War. But it's really unique when you think about all these events that occurred in a very short amount of time. All these transitional, or what historians used to say were watershed events. And that's the unique thing about the 1800s as a whole. not just for the United States, but for really all the nations and cultures in the land at the time. So many things happened in such a short amount of time. And the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad being a very logistically difficult enterprise at that time. Because if you really think about it, even with the rapid expansion of the railroad, there's a lot that goes into building railroads. It's not just laying the tracks. You also have to build the infrastructure that supports that railroad. And here in this wonderful map that also shows the topography and the elevation, seeing how the elevation changes because you're going from the plains over these very, very restrictive pieces of terrain called the Rocky Mountains, and yet other mountain ranges before you end up in the wonderful paradise of San Francisco, a city that was apparently always there. At least it was always shown on the maps all the way back from the days of Urbano Monte. But you can see how challenging this would be. Now, just to spell this out for everybody, because people were wondering what did Top Gear presenter James May have to do with trains, James May explained in 5 minutes exactly why it's very difficult for trains to ascend slopes with the lack of tractive force. Or you can look up the YouTube video that's less than 5 minutes long, why trains can't go up hills, featuring James May. And he says it's a bit of a misnomer. They're just not very good at it. Bottom line up front, you're not just building the tracks. You have to build bridges, you have to build tunnels, you have to actually do a site survey to ensure that the train can move through this severely restrictive terrain, these mountains, these passes. And let's not forget that the western portion of the United States was still populated by the Native Americans, most of which were hostile towards the efforts of the United States. And understandably so, even given the official or the unofficial history. You have a nation that's infringing upon your terrain. So what are you going to do about it? It's also intriguing when you think of the original story of Grenville Dodge, how he tried to settle west of Omaha, and it's stated that Native American raids forced him to go back to Omaha, and then eventually back to the east side of the Missouri River in Council Bluffs. How difficult would it have been to build all of these impressive tunnels? How exactly did they do it? Well, the official history tells us that they built the Transcontinental Railroad from west, starting in San Francisco and working their way east, and then starting in Council Bluffs, Iowa, or Omaha, depending on the account, and then working their way west. And it's also odd that the primary construction of this Transcontinental Railroad did start during the United States Civil War. I guess there was just nothing better to do. This is a very particularly strange image to me because the archive states that this is Council Bluffs, Iowa. Does this really look like Council Bluffs, Iowa? This looks more like something that's in Utah, I would think, but maybe it's just an error with the archive. It's not necessarily an indicator, it could just be a mistake. But it's amazing to me how many mistakes that we have with such a transformative event of the Transcontinental Railroad. And there's also the story of how Dodge, when he tried to settle in Nebraska with his family on his homestead out there, well, he had to get out of Dodge when Native Americans attacked. But he didn't let that deter him. He became the primary engineer for the Union Pacific, constructing from Council Bluffs to that fateful meeting out in Utah. So the story goes. Very easily overcoming all these difficult challenges, and by 1869, only 4 short years after the end of the United States Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Grenville Dodge himself also has a very colorful history. He was a general, a politician, an engineer, a surveyor, and of course he liked to make a profit. But there's many strange, overlapping, and conflicting accounts about Dodge's rise to power. Was he really engaging in land speculation, or did he know something else? Perhaps he knew of the existence of infrastructure. Why is it these surveyors seem to act as initial reconnaissance of this land? And why is there all this conflicting account with where the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad really is? Is it in Council Bluffs or is it in Omaha? I know if you're not from the area, you're going to say, what's really the difference? The cities are right next to each other. They're just separated by a little river. But it is interesting, though, how we have all these overlapping accounts. It's also interesting how there's all these accounts of economic depressions or recessions or panics, as they called them in the 1800s, and yet they didn't seem to affect certain people, such as the panic of the 1840s or 1850s, or whatever you want to call it, not affecting the economic welfare or prosperity of one Grenville Dodge. Is that actually how he even pronounced his name? Who knows? We don't know. but I always find it interesting when we examine these images. Here showing when the construction crews met in Utah with that golden spike. Ah, yes, we always have these unique details with these older images. So it's hard to know really what to make of them. Are they indefatigable proof of what actually happened in history? Or are they showing us that perhaps there's a lot more mystery than we like to realize? Or maybe it was because photography was in its infancy, and therefore if you question it, you just shouldn't question it, and you should just believe what you're told. And I suppose that's having static in the mind, just being obedient and doing as you're told. And here we have one of the golden spikes that was apparently used in the civilization of the Transcontinental Railroad. And why do I say that word, the civilization of the Transcontinental Railroad? Why would anybody bother with a golden spike? Who would even care? But here we have it. And yet if you go to Council Bluffs to this day, there is actually a golden spike monument. Now it's, of course, not gold, it's not painted gold, it's painted what looks to be yellow, and it's in this little park area in Council Bluffs, Iowa to this day. Although it seems as though all the present focus for the area is on Omaha, and Council Bluffs doesn't have the exact same focus. It's still a nice little park next to the rail area, but to be honest, it doesn't seem to be an area that has a lot of attention to it, as though for whatever reason it's overlooked. But you can look at this impressive yellow painted spike, and I guess it was cheaper to paint it yellow than to actually make it out of gold, unlike the Iowa State Capitol where it was cheaper to actually make the dome out of gold than to paint it gold. We just decided to paint this one yellow. But it's an impressive monument, and it indicates that this was the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. And here, near Fairview Cemetery in Council Bluffs, in fact, on one of the bluffs, you have the monument that was dedicated to the exact location where Abraham Lincoln and Grenville Dodge discussed their plans of setting Council Bluffs, or Omaha, as the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. What's exactly the real story behind this intriguing monument? And it's also interesting to note that there is not any single photograph or photographic evidence of Lincoln being present in Council Bluffs, although we understand that he was definitely there because it's documented in the media, and we have this wondrous monument, and nobody would build a monument for an event that did not happen, and this was a very critical event. Abraham Lincoln, the railroad lawyer, not the prairie lawyer, although if you look up his biography, it'll say he was a prairie lawyer. What's the difference? Well, I guess one sounds just a little bit more benign than the other. I'll leave that for you to decide. But in Council Bluffs to this day, just down from the precipice and not too far from the Ruth Ann Dodge Memorial, that dark angel, you have this very impressive monument. And what exactly does it represent? Was this just a unique monument to commemorate the visit of Abraham Lincoln to Council Bluffs? And it should be noted that this monument seems to have been established much later. Again, so the official history says, and if we just go by the plaques being absolutely correct, it does indicate that it was established later. But was it really? It's a very, very interesting little monument. A little bit of an obelisk with some natural stone, and then it's capped at the top by a sphere. How very interesting. And even looking at the city of Council Bluffs, it's a bit of an analogy, if you will, or similar to the accounts that we have of Dubuque, Iowa. Only now we're on the Missouri River, not the Mississippi River. But of course, Council Bluffs has its own share of legitimate and unique old world architecture. The Carnegie Library and the courthouse, and even the original land surveys of Council Bluffs, which oddly enough almost seem to predate the very construction of the city. Now, once again, I don't know, I don't have definitive evidence. It's just interesting to me that we have these very well-defined city surveys that occurred. Now, yes, maybe they got out there and they really had a good plan in mind for how they were going to grid out the city. And it should be noted that this Central Park is still more or less in the same location. But something else I find very intriguing about this grid pattern, or this mapping out or dividing of the land, is that they already divided land actually on the bluffs. How interesting. They were very confident in these bluffs that were just supposed to be temporary deposits of silt. And yet we have other maps and other sketches that indicate that somebody had a very good idea for how they wanted to lay out the city of Council Bluffs. Just one of those unique little details that we tend to overlook is all the complexities, all the different competing requirements that would have been around in what they called the platting or planning of a city. And again, I go back to this photograph because it's very interesting to me. The archive says that this is Council Bluffs, Iowa. This looks nothing like Iowa. And yet there are other images that do corroborate what we see in this image. Now, what do you think? Is this a legitimate image, or is this just merely something that's mislabeled in the archive? There's also the legacy that endures with Council Bluffs, Iowa. A city that started off as Canesville. It was settled initially by Mormons, and then of course followed on by people such as Grenville Dodge. Also interesting that after Grenville Dodge's attempt to settle in Nebraska failed, as a result of Native American raids, he decided to relocate to Council Bluffs, and just decided to become a banker, a land surveyor. In between times in service as a general during the Civil War, he also established a apparently very effective intelligence network, and even utilized African Americans as effective agents or a force of reconnaissance, because the official history tells us that for some unknown reason, the Southern forces or the Confederate Army didn't bother to actually check African Americans when they traveled through their lines. How very peculiar. And you can look up the official history behind that statement, because apparently they didn't attract a lot of attention. It's very, very strange. Just as strange as these early images of Council Bluffs. And here we can even see this moon tower. Yes, we haven't really talked about these moon towers on the channel before. These impressive towers that beamed out light that were like the Eye of Sauron. That's apparently how they lit cities in the 1800s before the implementation of the light bulb from the great Thomas Edison, so the official history says. And Council Bluffs, much like many other cities being in a river valley, has a history of being flooded. Who would have ever thought that was a situation? You can actually see the bluffs in the distance here, and yet, oddly enough, compared to what we see in current images and video and walking there yourself, the bluffs in Council Bluffs are completely devoid of vegetation. It reminds me just of the bluffs that we looked at in Dubuque on the other side of Iowa. How very interesting. What happened to all the trees? And if you go there to this day, you'll find that there are trees that seem that they've been there for a very long time. Now, yes, I know we can cut down the trees and count the rings, and it should be incontrovertible evidence. But is it? There's always this time when we look at these images of these colleges, these municipal buildings, and these very incredible and elaborate structures, all built during the mid-1800s, when the city was just getting off the ground, when apparently anybody who was a settler and a land surveyor could relocate to the city and just arbitrarily decide to become a banker. Well, if you have that ability, then why couldn't you build structures like this? Many of these structures which still endure to this day, at least the ones that were not removed during urban renewal or the attempts of new development in Council Bluffs. And why do we have this conflicting history with what the actual terminus point is of Council Bluffs and Omaha for the Transcontinental Railroad? You'd think it's a pretty big deal. Of course, again, the official history says Council Bluffs was the location Lincoln selected, but Omaha was really the main transition point. And that's why the Union Pacific was headquartered in Omaha. It all makes perfect sense. It's all very well documented. Ah, yes, more of these interesting devices in this particular shop. And yet other signs that indicate that well after the Civil War, there was a big sign of militarism in the northern United States. How fascinating. And going back to that earlier question about how African Americans were able to pass through the picket lines of Confederate forces during the Civil War, we also have this explanation that the reason there were military academies in the South is because they feared an uprising. And yet there's just as much evidence to support there was just as much militarism in the northern states. And what was the explanation for that? And everywhere you look, whether it's any sort of school or town or even a university, we can find lots of evidence of individuals in military uniforms. And we have the old courthouse in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And what happened to this particular structure? Lost over time when we look at the details of this particular image, and we see this elaborate construction. And yes, I can tell you with a total straight face that no one's going to build a structure like this in Council Bluffs or really anywhere. They're just not inclined. It's not efficient, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But when you look at the different images that we have, some being drawings, some being photographs, others being postcards, it does portray this image that Council Bluffs once had incredible structures, with a lot of detailing that went into it and a lot of difficulty with the construction. And they were certainly not wood shacks that we'd expect. Even this particular series of stores in this one building in downtown Council Bluffs is very impressive. elaborate constructions of brick and something that seems like it would endure anything. It's just a restaurant. You don't even need to name it. Blank book manufacturers, job printing. How interesting. And, as I said earlier, many of these structures still endure in Council Bluffs. But what's really the story that's being told to us here? Do we really understand the Transcontinental Railroad story as it's relayed to us, or are we actually seeing indicators that it's possible that all of what we're looking at was already present? That the reason that these bluffs were completely devoid of life is because that's exactly the condition that they were found in. In other words, all this incredible infrastructure that we see, these buildings, even the very Transcontinental Railroad itself and the bridges, were all there. They were just simply in a state of disrepair, and they had to be repaired. They had to be salvaged and brought back into service. Was that really the legacy of Grenville Dodge? It's also interesting to note that many historians indicate that Grenville Dodge was even more impactful on the history of the United States after the Civil War than individuals such as Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. And even looking at other images of Council Bluffs, we can find in this 1950s graduation photo from Abraham Lincoln High School. Yes, another high school named either Abraham Lincoln High School or Central High School, where we see the impressive construction and a very lovely cartouche right here above the doorway. And what exactly happened to this high school with its elaborate block construction? Well, no doubt it was torn down and it's been replaced by a more modern and current high school in Council Bluffs, which I'm not going to show you because it's an image you're all too familiar with, and there's many, many thousands of buildings everywhere that look exactly like it. But that was not always the case. And then, of course, the houses. And we've looked at the individual houses that, once again, are quite intriguing. All this effort to build this elaborate house, all the wealth that went into it, and yet all we could do is lay out some boards that lead up to the house. Well, maybe there was something else going on. Maybe that was at the end of the construction. Again, I'm trying to play it from both ways. But then we have these other unique images that show construction of churches. And there's even the Broadway Methodist Church that continues to endure in Council Bluffs to this day. And what is exactly with these unique concrete pieces, at least that's what we think they are, that are part of the brick construction with this particular church? And here we have this very impressive compound off of the rail tracks, and very large and yet also with a smokestack, again giving indications of perhaps more advanced technology, certainly more infrastructure and more production capabilities that went into establishing this incredible structure. And what about the mayor's house here? Yes, this is stated to be the mayor's house, surrounded by trees and yet showing more elaborate construction itself. It's an all too common story, and yet we see it everywhere that we look. But why do we have this definitive evidence all in one spot? I suppose once again I'm telling you that if you really want to try to explore the old world, here we have the old train station in Council Bluffs, a very subtle and modest structure. Yes, sarcasm off the charts once again. That gives us the idea that there was really no limitations to what could be done in the 1800s. And of course, if we take all the achievements and compare them with all the achievements from the 20th and the 21st century, well, which century has the most achievements? Is that all explained because there was so much more money? Where the heck did Grenville Dodge get his money to open a bank in Council Bluffs? Well, there's also the fact that even Grenville Dodge's personal historian says that he altered the historical account himself. Yes, a historian indicating that a famous individual altered the historical account to be more favorable. And in fact, Grenville Dodge did such a good job of altering the historical account, apparently, that we know virtually nothing about his wife, Ruth Ann Dodge. Very, very little, aside from the fact that when he met her in Peru, Illinois, on his way out to Iowa and Nebraska, that she could ride and shoot as well as he could, although she never had a negligent discharge with her pistol as he did during the Civil War. Fortunately, he wasn't working for a division commander from the United States Army in Iraq and wasn't given a general officer memorandum of reprimand that ended his career. No, he moved on and became very, very successful. And looking at some of these other older houses, and many of these houses still exist in Council Bluffs, and they're actually built on the bluff. How interesting, on the deposit of silt. And here we see these trees that look like they've been there for a long time. So what exactly happened? Why do we have these conflicting accounts where we see these images that are stated to be in the same geographical location, yet we have discrepancies? Discrepancies with the structures, discrepancies with the infrastructure available, and even discrepancies with the foliage. It's really, really odd. Now, it could be possible that yes, in the later 1800s, they decided to do a tree planting program and brought in all these trees rapidly in a very short amount of time. But oftentimes what you'll find is there's a very unique indicator with the limited chronological documenting of the photos. Now again, I wasn't there, and none of the historians that studied this were there either. We don't exactly know which photo came first or what predated what. Yes, you can take the official archives at face value and they may be correct. And once again, I'm not suggesting that there's any sort of intentional conspiracy. There never needs to be. People may simply just not have known what was actually happening. And there's all kinds of strange legends and odd events associated with Council Bluffs that endure to this day. It may be the reason why the area tends to be overlooked and most eyes are on Omaha. And of course we know who's in Omaha to this day, who's recently retired, and why from official history it has the eyes all on it and not on Council Bluffs. But yet here we have this very modest high school built on these odd terraces. And what's the point of this very large door behind it? Why aren't we building high schools like this now? For that matter, why aren't we building courthouses like this now? Well, there's just simply no need. We don't have artisans and craftsmen. We don't have all the people that care so much about these things like they apparently did in the 1800s. They weren't worried about anything else, fighting a civil war, having to deal with hostile Native Americans, which I also found interesting because the Dakota War, which was an uprising of Native Americans in western Minnesota, occurred during the Civil War. Ah, yes, this interesting moon tower. And what exactly was this? Was this again some remaining technology from the old world that was a superior form of lighting? I mean, imagine Mr. Burns in The Simpsons going with this instead of his sunblocker device. Think of it, Smithers. We could always be generating light and always increasing the power outtake and the signature in the city. What exactly was this moon tower, though? What did it really represent? And here we're looking at this one in Austin, Texas, because these did really exist. But apparently the one in Council Bluffs malfunctioned. There were all sorts of issues with it. And they even brought in an expert from nearby or faraway Omaha, depending on which historical account you consult, to evaluate it. And they found that these devices were not properly functioning. So therefore they had to be replaced. It was an embarrassment. Again, conflicting accounts. The people of the town loved them. They didn't like them. They didn't work. Not exactly sure what to make of them. What exactly is this that we're looking at right now? Is this a photograph? Is this a sketch? It's supposed to be Council Bluffs, and it shows the moon tower. Although you may recall when we looked at the official historical photograph of the band from Oskaloosa, Iowa, playing in Council Bluffs, Iowa, we could clearly see this tower in the background. So again, I'm not really sure what to make of it. Here we have this very interesting image that shows one of these incredible spires, and this is something else that's been lost over time. For whatever reason, these spires were either unsafe or for whatever reason were not desirable to continue with these historical buildings. And of course, we always have the overlap in terms of which historical buildings we decide to preserve. For example, why wasn't this incredible and beautiful building preserved over time? What was it? Is it a post office? Is it a federal building of some sort? What was its original intention? If it was supposed to be a post office or a federal building, then why does it look more like a post office or federal building? And keep in mind the other big question that I have about Council Bluffs. If this was designated as the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad, then why is it Council Bluffs didn't become the incredible large city? Why was it Omaha on the other side of the river? It just doesn't seem to make any sense, especially when we really try to deconflict all these historical accounts that we have of these Native American raids that were occurring just west of Omaha. It apparently necessitated the establishment of Fort Omaha, which served a variety of purposes, not just during the Plains Indian Wars, but even beyond the Spanish-American War, World War I, and even World War II. It was used to inter Italian prisoners of war, so the official history says. But why is it that we always have these impressive courthouses? Why do we have these elaborate constructions that just seem to be completely unnecessary? Why is it the top of the cupola on this courthouse looks very, very similar to the moon tower? So many coincidences, and yet many unanswered questions. And of course, people always complain about the fact that there's unanswered questions. Well, if you don't want to ask questions, then there's no shortage of content that you can just watch out there that'll keep your mind occupied, as it seems to be intended. And by all means, if that's what you want to do, then go ahead. But what I always find interesting is we can always tell who's curious. We can always determine who really wants to keep looking for answers, even if there's not easy answers provided. In Council Bluffs, there also remains this squirrel cage jail. This very, very odd apparatus and contraption that seems to be particular to the Midwest. And this is the structure of the squirrel cage jail, or the Potawatomi County Jail in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Quite an elaborate building just to have a jail in it, wouldn't you say? It doesn't exactly look like you'd expect any jail to be. And yet if you actually go inside and take a look at this jail, which you can for the low price of $10 today, you can get an idea of how these squirrel cage jails actually operated. Now apparently this one ceased to operate in terms of its revolving capacity in the early 1960s, and this jail was closed down in the late 1960s. Again, coincidentally corresponding to that time of urban renewal. But what an elaborate structure. Again, showing these strange concrete adornments, if that's indeed what they are, or if there's some other material. Again, I don't know. Someone says you can just do a chemical analysis on something and you can determine exactly what it's made of. Really? Okay, maybe, sure, why not? But it's strange to me that a structure like this endures with this kind of detail. For example, why bother with that detail with the brick when it's just supposed to be built from the ground up to be a prison? It again seems like something that's unnecessary. Or again, is it possible that this structure originally had a very different purpose when it was constructed by whoever for whatever reason, and then it was repurposed to be a prison? And we decided to do these squirrel cage prisons as some kind of special treatment, or dare I say punishment, for those who weren't conforming. And Council Bluffs still has its original Carnegie Library. Ah, yes. And I'm reminded of the detailed construction that we have in the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa that endures. Free public library. How fitting. But yet, why? Why do we have all this detail for this public library? Why is Carnegie associated with so many libraries? And it's currently purposed as a Union Pacific Railroad museum. And there's other interesting structures that endure in downtown Council Bluffs, even the old City Hall right here that we're looking at. Has a little bit of what would probably be termed as Art Deco, but what exactly do these symbols represent? Is this supposed to be some representation of law enforcement? Is this supposed to be some kind of city symbol of Council Bluffs? Just like the griffin is the unknown symbol of the United States that was very popular in the early 1900s. It's really, really strange. And then even these other structures that seem to have different types of construction with the base or the first two floors, and then the subsequent floors being constructed out of brick. What an interesting device there. Once again, a cartouche, although this is one of the unique ones that we see. I wonder what effect just looking at this cartouche will have on certain people. I can't wait to find out. But what's the actual story behind this building? And here the United Methodist Church on Broadway, or the Broadway United Methodist Church, and you can see on this stone, or this foundation stone, I guess, when it was constructed in the 1890s. And it should be noted that there are many images of this structure from the time frame, and yet I'm also interested in looking at it in present day because you can see all the alterations that have been made on it over time. And yet you can also see how it seems to endure with its original construction, impervious to the passage of time, impervious to all the elements that have befallen Council Bluffs over time. What exactly does it really represent? What material is this? Is this just limestone that this is constructed out of? Is this something that they pulled out of all the quarries that are in the immediate area? Or is this the remnants of some kind of megastructure? Are the bluffs in Council Bluffs actually the remnants of a megastructure? Why is it with every one of these cities, anywhere and everywhere, there always seems to be some sort of nearby bluff that provides these construction materials, such as Grandad Bluff in La Crosse in Wisconsin, off the Mississippi? There always seems to be no shortage of these construction materials, and yet they seem to endure. So if everything's about making money and showing proper capitalism, then wouldn't it be cheaper just to build one building that lasts, not for decades, but for hundreds of years, as opposed to constantly building new and more temporary structures that last maybe 10 to 20 years? Well, that's a question I leave to you. It's just one of those questions we constantly encounter when we look at these impressive structures. And going out to Fairmount Park in Council Bluffs, again on one of the other bluffs, And here you can see the age with one of these trees, and also the extensive root system with any existing tree. And why am I highlighting this? It's intriguing to me that these bluffs are just supposed to be made out of silt, or the loess material that was brought in by the wind. And that's what built up these bluffs in Iowa. These incredible loess hills in a land that's not necessarily known for hills. Although again, Iowa's always full of surprises. And even to this very day, you can walk along these bluffs and you can see all the trees, or the loess hills, or whatever we're calling them today, and try to get an idea for what happened in the past. Now, it seems as though someone understood that whatever these bluffs were really constructed out of, they were very, very stable. They would endure for many years. And you can walk incessantly for hours if you're so inclined and try to get an idea for how this all happened. And pay particular attention for how much vegetation there is on this particular bluff to this very day. And compare and contrast it with the earlier images that we looked at that showed the area being completely devoid of trees. Now again, it's been a very long time. It has been over 100 years. I do concede the fact that they could have established trees, and yet when you go to different areas, you'll find that there are trees that are clearly very old. And of course, you'll look at the photographs, and it seems that many of the trees have always been there, except for the photographs that show the area completely devoid of trees. It's just another one of those little inconsistencies that we see, and I like to pay close attention to, because it seems to be telling us that things are not exactly as we understand it. And when you reach the overlook point here in the park, you of course can see Omaha in the distance, the city that was focused on, and currently the economic vibrancy in the area. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with Council Bluffs. You can certainly visit it and come to your own conclusions, and if you live there, it's certainly a nice enough town. It is part of Iowa. But it's just interesting to me that Council Bluffs did not become the main center city of the area. And even looking at the cemetery here, very, very interesting. And even the naming convention of this, fair in both the park and the cemetery. And it's in this cemetery that we have the memorial to Grenville Dodge's wife, Ruth Ann Dodge, that we don't really know much about, aside from the fact that he married her in Peru, Illinois, and she was good at riding and shooting. The cemetery is also very interesting in and of itself as well. And even looking at the Dark Angel of the Transcontinental Railroad, another one of these statues that appears very lifelike. It's very disturbing and has many legends and myths. It's even stated to this day that if you touch this angel, you will die in a very short amount of time. And if you look into her eyes, you'll die in a very short amount of time. Now, these may all just be legends and myths, and it should be worth noting that when you look at this statue, it seems no one was really afraid to touch it. But it's very bizarre in its lifelike appearance. I wonder if we're looking at something much more than just a statue. When you look at the eyes, and you can really see the disturbing account for what this may be. Is this really a statue, or is this something much more? And why are there so many legends and legacies associated with it? What are your thoughts on the Transcontinental Railroad and the Dark Angel? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Chance. That's where the real possibilities lie. Even a scientist can't tell you that this thing is going to turn this way or that way. And to me, that's really neat.